Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
When you and Rosenquist and Lichtenstein all were working very independently of each other, but evolving a same kind of attitude, does that seem odd to you, that you all began to look at the world in the same way?
I think we just read a lot of comic books, and it just happened to come out then.
Well,
because comic books make things the way they are really today. I mean, the way things happen in New York now, it's like being in a Western movie.
My guest today is Jennifer Dasal. She is the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Her research expertise includes contemporary art with a particular interest in women's artists and Asian art. Prior to joining the NCMA, she held positions as an assistant to the curator of Western art at the Snite Museum at the University of Notre Dame in Notre Dame, Indiana, and at the Richard L. Nelson Art Gallery, the University of California, Davis. She has additional experience working in commercial art galleries as well. Dassl also hosts the ArtCurious podcast. It's a bi-weekly show exposing the unexpected, the slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. The show has been named one of the best podcasts by the Oprah magazine, and by PC Magazine. This isn't like a college lecture droning on about archaic art terminology. This art podcast is like Festivus. It's art history for the rest of us. So if you can forgive me for my Seinfeld reference, ArtCurious is interested in the juicy stuff, like did Van Gogh actually commit suicide? Was a British painter actually Jack the Ripper? And how the CIA covertly supported modern art. These questions also help form the basis for her book, ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of ArtCurious, the book, Publishers Weekly says, Dassl reveals in this entertaining survey the weird, wacky, and unbelievable backstories of some of the world's greatest artists and the most famous works of art. Both art aficionados and novices will find something to appreciate in this offbeat and informative outing. And I will add that it is super fun to read, and we're very proud to have the art historian, podcaster, and author with us today. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm actually art curious, Jennifer, of the different types of stories in art history. Which one is actually your favorite? Is it the unexpected art history stories, the slightly odd, or the strangely wonderful?
To me, they all
I knew you'd say that.
Together.
I had a feeling.
I love them all. They're all my babies. I definitely love the ones that really do take you aback, though. So if there is something that makes you stand back and go, I did not expect that, I think those are, for me, the most fun.
Jennifer, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today we have Hell's Belle Belgian Blonde Ale from the Big Boss Brewing Company of Raleigh, North Carolina. Hell's Belle is a subtle but complex ale that is meant to be a showcase for Big Boss's favorite Belgian yeast and beautiful Belgian malts. These elements produce a clean, spicy citrus finish, and this Belgian Blonde Ale remains light and refreshing, but still packs a 7% finish, and it pairs perfectly with spicy Thai or Indian food. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click on the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get new material immediately after it's published. Subscribing is the only way to get those new shows right away. To the ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from nearly 60 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I would like to say thank you. And now I raise my Hell's Belle Belgian Blonde Ale very high. And to all those art-curious types out there, and to the unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful in art history, I say cheers. In your chapter, The Lady Vanishes, the multiple thefts and forgeries of the Mona Lisa, you mentioned, as you just said, that you were taken aback, in this case as a student, by a comment that a college professor had made about the Mona Lisa that is on display in the Louvre being a fake. So Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, it's one of the most famous paintings, and certainly it has an interesting history. Would you take us through some of that history, and is the current painting that's on display truly a fake?
Absolutely. Absolutely taking you through the history, and then I'll get to the fake part in just a moment.
Okay.
It really is so interesting. So as you mentioned, it's at the Louvre today. And part of the reason that it is actually because the work was originally supposed to be, in theory, as much as we know, for a particular person. It was a commission of a portrait of a particular man's wife, a Florentine merchant. And the work, for some reason, we don't know why, never actually left Leonardo's studio. So he kept it in his possession for the entirety of his lifetime, which is, for a commission, extremely odd. And at the end of his life, he went to France and worked under the behest of the French King Francis I. And so he took the painting along with him. And after his death, it was then inherited by one of his pupils, who then sold it to the French king. And that is why it ended up in France and why it's still there today. It was sort of handed down. It was on display at a few different, courtly houses and palaces. And it actually, I love the story that it was hung in Napoleon's bedroom for a brief time, which is pretty cool, just to know that it's been in Napoleon's room until it finally ended up at the Louvre, which was one of those royal palaces. And then the palace became a museum. And that is where it is today. And in 1911, it was stolen for the first time, according to my professor, by a man who used to work at the Louvre, who was a glazier. So basically, he fitted the glass into frames for the paintings and pictures that are in the Louvre. And the work of art was gone for about 2.5 years before it was finally uncovered, unharmed in Italy. And there has been this back and forth over the years, especially in the 1930s, 1940s, where an alternative story came up that said that it was this grand master plan of this marquis in Argentina who was working with an art forger, and that the real Mona Lisa may have been returned, it may have not. And my professor, when I was back in college, this was about 20 years ago, was firmly in the camp of believing herself that the Mona Lisa that you see was one of these supposed reproductions and not the actual painting. I'm a curator today, and I tend to err more on the side of caution when it comes to reproductions of works of art and so forth. I can't say for sure, because the fact of the matter is that you cannot get very close to the Mona Lisa, even as an art expert. So I can't go up there and look really closely and give you my opinion on whether or not it's the real deal. But my tendency is to believe that the work of art's value comes from our experience with it. If nobody sees a work of art, then it inherently is just, it's not nothing, but it doesn't have that same value and power. So having a work on display, that's what actually gives it its power and its value. So I think it's the real deal, but I can see why my professor thought that maybe it's not.
You have several vignettes throughout your book, and one of those covers a medical interpretation of the Mona Lisa. Some doctors believe a condition accounts for the famous smile and other attributes of the woman featured in the painting. What do they suggest those conditions were?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I love this whole medical take on paintings that has been of interest, I think, in the past couple of decades. A number of people say that the fact that we have that odd smile that Mona Lisa is so famous for, it looks like it's only a half smile or a partial smile. And some doctors have said that they believe it's a kind of temporary facial paralysis, something known as Belle's palsy. And really interestingly, they say that that kind of affliction is most common in women who are either pregnant or postpartum, that they are about 3 or 4 times more likely to experience that kind of facial paralysis. And there is the thought that the painting was actually commissioned after the birth of Lisa del Giocondo, so the woman who is apparently Mona Lisa, Lisa del Giocondo, about a year or two after her son was born. So it does seem to make good sense that potentially, if that is a portrait that was made to celebrate the birth of a baby, that this woman may have been experiencing this side effect of having had a child. And another element is that people think that perhaps it could be something that is a side effect of hypothyroidism, and that other people have also pointed to some additional strange attributes of Mona Lisa. The fact that she has kind of a sallow-looking skin, basically non-existent eyebrows, and maybe even the beginnings of a goiter, some people say, is that possibly that's all combined with that a little bit of temporary facial paralysis to say that perhaps she was dealing with a severe case of hypothyroidism. So today, we're very lucky in that if you do have a thyroid condition, there's medication and treatment available. But obviously, back in the Renaissance, that wouldn't have been as much of a thing. So it's very interesting to know. We don't have a lot of documentation to back this up, but it's certainly interesting to have doctors come in and be able to diagnose people who are dead, 500 years ago.
On to another artist. There's been a great deal of research. Many books have been written about the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper. Some, including Patricia Cornwell, who you feature in your book, identify British artist Walter Sickert as the killer. Sickert's art is very dark, with depictions of nude women and even a painting of Jack the Ripper's bedroom. How would you answer the question that you posited in Chapter 3 of your book? Was British painter Walter Sickert really Jack the Ripper?
Oh, it is such a good question. And I wish that I could determine and even say in the book definitively one way or another. But it is really interesting. Patricia Cornwell, in the last 20 years in particular, has become probably one of the world's most foremost experts on Sickert, and certainly one of the biggest collectors of his work, simply because she's been purchasing works of art to really have them examined and to back up these claims that she feels very strongly that he was Jack the Ripper. A lot of the information that she has given, she's now written 3 books on the subject. A lot of the information she shares in those books is pretty circumstantial, but at the same time, there are some, potential similarities depending on what you want to believe, like the particular runs of stationery that Walter Sickert was apparently known to have used that match up to some of the so-called Ripper letters that were sent to the police in the years after the murder, that there are doodles and drawings over several Ripper letters that might match up with someone who is an artist by trade, for example, and also some purported DNA evidence that's been somewhat debunked. In later editions of her book, Patricia Cornwell has talked about how it's not a one-to-one comparison of DNA, the way that we might be able to identify a killer today if their DNA matches, for example, but more of a limiting of a percentage of the population. So she never is able to point directly and very factually to say that Jack the Ripper was Walter Sickert and vice versa. But as you mentioned, he does have some works of art that are very dark and kind of gruesome. He does do a series called The Camden Town Murders that also shows a sex worker who has been murdered in her bed that has a lot of these same similarities to the Ripper murders. And so we know that he was very interested in that darker side of society, of Victorian society. But my take is that a lot of people did at that point. I'm thinking in particular of some of the French post-impressionists of whom Walter Sickert was very good friends. So I'm thinking especially about Edgar Degas, whose works I think many people think of as being these beautiful ballet scenes that actually have a very dark tinge to them. And Sickert was the same way. He wanted to show the dark underbelly of Victorian society, and even using works that were pulled from the headlines and creating these pieces that were a little more sensational. And you could see that also as kind of being good marketing in some ways, and that he, for whatever his faults may be, he's grabbing attention and getting people to look at his art because he's doing something a little bit scandalous with it. At the same time, I don't have any other really great, I myself am not a ripperologist, which I think is...
Is that the term?
It's hilarious that it's a real term. Yes, exactly. Ripperologist. But, there aren't a lot of other really great people that have been put out there by ripperologists. There's a lot of theories, but I have to say, I'm not totally convinced that he was Jack the Ripper, but I'm not convinced either. So I remain skeptical, but a little wary of the artist, for sure.
Well, your book also talks about the dark side of Degas' work as well.
Yes, for sure. I keep thinking about a lot of these scenes that you see of Degas where he's painting ballerinas as they're performing or even just rehearsing for performances. A lot of the times they're being shown in very garish settings, very stark light, where they look like almost they're grimacing. And in particular, they are often shown with either audience members or people who were there watching them from behind the scenes, either during those rehearsals or during an actual performance. And a lot of them tend to be men who were standing off in the shadows, who really, to our modern eyes, look very predatory. And that is certainly something that has been experienced throughout time, but especially at the end of the 19th century, where there was this common link between actresses and dancers in particular who were taken advantage of and sometimes even lost their lives by men who were seeing them as easy targets, because these were women who were out after dark at many points, in a time where women going out after dark on their own was seen as completely taboo for a quote unquote good woman of good standing and good stature. So seeing those kind of works, which we usually think of as just being so innocently pretty, through that lens is, I think, very shocking to many people.
Well, speaking of that darkness, in the evaluation of a piece of art, is it possible to separate the work, the piece of art, from the artist? For example, is it possible to appreciate the artwork of Adolf Hitler?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't received well at the time while he was living in Vienna. And I won't get into the conjecture about would history have been different if he had not been rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts on 2 occasions. We can't get into that.
Right.
But back to that original question. In general, is it possible to separate the art from the person, even if the person is horrible or even worse, evil?
Oh, Rob, I have to say I struggle with this myself, because I think in recent years, Adolf Hitler aside, but big artists like Picasso and Gauguin have really been coming under scrutiny because of their womanizing and their misogyny, even their violence towards women. Picasso was famously abusive. And, you can make the same claims about people like Hemingway. It really extends to art across the board, not just the visual art. And it's really difficult because it's hard to keep that out of your mind when you're looking at a work of art. I think people really do fall into two camps. There's the people who say you must separate the art from the person. And then there's people who say you can't. You have to either accept it whole hog or not at all. And I don't know which one is best. I don't know what to believe. And I'm really kind of curious to see how things will play out, especially in the next few years. I think it'll be pretty slow, if anything, to come to any major decision. But I have a really hard time believing that all of a sudden we're just going to say, Picasso is not something we're going to show anymore, because these artists have been so hugely influential and formative, especially in the history of Western art. So I don't see it as being something that would be easily accepted. At the same time, I think one of the ways that you deal with these issues is that you put a lot more context out there. So you can talk about Picasso, you can show his work, but I don't think we should be straying away from a work that maybe showcases or hints at his misogyny in any way. I think it's better just to have the conversation out there.
Well, let's just say, I'll put you in a tough spot here. Let's say somebody acquired a Hitler painting, which of course is not generally considered great art, but you could, as a curator, you could determine whether you would put it in your museum. Would it be an automatic no? Or as you said before, it could be placed into context, tell a full story, and then it could be, under the right circumstance, be something you would consider putting in your museum?
Ooh, that is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there almost has to be this sliding scale of badness, right? So, and Hitler, of course, would be on the really bad end.
Yeah, he's on the bad end.
Exactly. So I feel like in that case, I would probably want it to be an automatic no, especially as you're referencing the fact that his works are not known to be good. There are collectors out there who collect all kinds of Hitler memorabilia, and certainly the paintings fall into those. But at the same time, a lot of things with exhibitions and art exhibitions is that we want to balance that educational aspect with any sort of acclaim or praise that might be seen as a side effect of having cachet of being in an art exhibition. So I personally would want to not have to worry about that. I don't want to make it seem as being any sort of claim that Hitler was an amazing artist and give any sort of praise in that direction for multiple reasons. So I think it, for me, would be an automatic no. Maybe for a different curator, maybe not.
Right. And the first thing I thought, I'm not an art historian, but I wonder what Andy Warhol's answer to that would be.
Yes. Ooh, that is such a good question. I'm sure he would probably, well, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that he would probably lean into wanting to show it for probably just the attention aspect alone. Obviously, Warhol was famous for talking about everybody gets their 15 minutes of fame. I think Hitler has had more than enough of his 15 minutes.
He has.
But certainly, I think Warhol would be really interested in having that rounded out to explain his art as well. Really interesting question.
The Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh died of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was only 37 at the time. That was in 1890. He suffered from depression and other mental illness. He was never successful as an artist during his life. The circumstances, though, surrounding the event that ended his life. Still a young man, and his final words, of course, the sadness will last forever. That leads some to believe this was not a suicide, but a homicide. Is it possible that Vincent van Gogh was murdered? I almost did dun, 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 but I didn't.
Oh.
I avoided it. I avoided
it. You could have done it, and I would have loved it anyway.
Okay.
It's a really interesting story, and this one started gaining a little bit of traction, I would say, or a lot more media interest about 10 years ago when a major, huge, almost 1,000-page biography of Vincent van Gogh, really purported to be the #1 biography of the artist, was put out by a couple of writers called Stephen Nafee and Gregory White Smith. And in their huge, thoroughly vetted, thoroughly researched biography, in a index in the back of their book, they referenced that they seem to have found some information in various archives that linked up with this idea that Van Gogh was shot either accidentally or on purpose by a boy who was a teenager at the time, who had this interest in the Wild West and was apparently quite a bully and liked to target Van Gogh and other people during his times when his family was visiting on vacation in Auvers-sur-Oise, which is the town in which Van Gogh died. And, it's a really compelling theory. I think it's really interesting. There tends to be this mystery around Van Gogh, and there are some very interesting holes in looking in his death and the fact that he had written a letter to his brother even just the day before that he mailed off that talked about the big order for paint that he put in and that he was feeling very positive about his career. And yes, he was not a successful artist. He was someone who dealt with mental illness his whole life. But at the same time, he was getting shown very small at this point in his life. He was in only a handful of exhibitions, but his brother was supporting him. He was starting to get a little bit more attention. So the timing for many people does feel a little bit off. Why would somebody who is possibly on the upswing in his career for the first time ever taking his own life? So I see that this is a really convenient theory to explain some of those differences there. At the same time, it's really hard not to pay really good attention to the fact that he did struggle so much with his mental illnesses during his lifetime. And in only the year prior to his death, he committed himself to a mental health asylum. And then even when he was at the asylum, he did try to commit suicide at that point. So as knowing, how terrible depression can be and how difficult it can be to deal with that, especially at a point when there wasn't a lot of mental health and medication that he could have used. He was certainly under a doctor's supervision, and the doctor did try to treat him with the medication that was available at the time. But I can't imagine that it would have been very successful. So for me, it doesn't seem like a stretch to assume that Van Gogh could have killed himself, especially with a hasty decision or something that came at a moment of despair. So I still tend to believe that he did end up ending his own life, but it sure is really interesting to think that maybe that wasn't what actually happened.
So Van Gogh's The Starry Night, it's a very interesting interpretation of almost the entire cosmos. So regarding UFOs possibly being captured in paintings centuries ago, not necessarily in the starry night, but I always think of the cosmos when I look at that.
Mm-hmm.
For the conspiracy-minded,
Yes.
are these simply an artist interpretation of the sky at the time, or is it possible that they're actually capturing UFOs?
Ooh, yeah. I think it depends on what you believe in terms of UFOs in general, for sure. And I think that's another moment where we talked about ripperologists earlier. And in this case, there's also ufologists, I suppose they're called. And a number of people do believe that you can go back through art history and point to these particular works of art that document a historical event or a presence of alien life. And a lot of the paintings that they put forward as, quote unquote evidence do stem from the medieval period and the Renaissance period. And I think in those cases, it's the opportunity to describe something that you can't really understand visually. So as much as I would love to believe, or I would love to have this artistic inspiration and saying like, oh, I see an alien in this, I see a UFO, I think these were really their ways to visualize something like angels or gods, or ghosts, something that we can't very well physically express in painting. And the way to do that is thinking about a god or an angel up in heaven. Maybe they're sitting on a star and zooming through the sky the way that a UFO would. So I think, again, it's one of those situations of it being in the eye of the beholder. I am not much of a believer. I wish I was. I think it would be very cool to experience some kind of alien event. But I think that's just a visual interpretation of something far more mundane.
Are there any of those paintings out there that you say the description that you just had applies to almost all of them, but this one looks a little suspicious?
I think it's really fun that I don't know that I would necessarily think that it's suspicious, but I think it's really interesting is that there's a painting in a work called The Virgin and Child with St. John that's in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And it has become such an touchstone for people who believe in the presence of UFOs and art in particular, that people have started calling it the Madonna of the UFO. So very specifically naming it because it has this little vessel that seems to be flying near that looks like it's emanating these golden rays. So I love that idea that that's just automatically where our modern minds go after being exposed to so many stories in the past century of alien abductions and sightings. And I love it. I think that's very cool. Do I necessarily believe it? No. I think with it being a holy scene or a spiritual scene in the first place just automatically adds to that mystery there. I think that explains it away.
Now, I'm supposed to be a serious historian, and I'm asking about all this macabre stuff and UFOs. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all. I think it's very fun.
So old paintings and houses I might as well just keep along the same track here. Old paintings and houses sometimes have supernatural properties or conduits for spirits in scary movies, or even in Scooby-Doo. I'm sure you didn't think there would be a Scooby-Doo reference in the interview, but there you go. Since we've covered UFOs already, are there any examples in art history of an artist capturing a ghost or phantasm in a painting or piece of art?
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting. In the book, I have a chapter that I dedicated to two particular artists who said that they were creating works of art basically as mediums or conduits for other worldly spirits who were painting works of art through them. So these were two women. One was a British painter named Georgiana Houghton, and the other is Hilma af Klint, who was a Swedish artist who I think has really become a little bit of an art world darling in the past few years because there was this major blockbuster exhibition of her work a couple of years ago back in the Guggenheim in New York. And both of these women were devastated by losses of their family members. In both of their cases, I believe it was their sisters who died, whose passing just completely crushed them. And this was at the point at which spiritualism, so table tapping and seances, were really starting to take hold. And both of them found these spiritualist events and activities to be really comforting as potential ways to reach out to their loved ones. And during that time, both of them women, who neither of whom knew each other, they did not know of their artworks to the best of our knowledge during their lifetimes. Both of them had these separate instances where they were apparently communing with some ghost or another spiritual being who then had them paint or draw these really interesting abstract works of art in most cases. So for sure, I think that depends on how you want to define being able to capture a ghost or spirit. But that is one way to say that a work of art was actually literally being created by a ghost through the form of these two women. The other thing that I'm thinking of is in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, when photography was really becoming super well known and more experimental. People were really trying it out for the first time as this new artistic medium. And that a lot of people got really interested in trying to capture the presence of a ghost. In most cases, this ended up being, a fake out, a charlatan. There's one man in particular that I'm thinking of named William Mumbler, who basically claimed that he would take your photograph and make a portrait of you and would claim to capture your dead loved one's presence while you were sitting there. And this became hugely popular. And even Mary Todd Lincoln asked to create a portrait, and that you can see in the image of it, you see Abraham Lincoln kind of leaning over her shoulder, who at this point he had been dead 5 years. So I think of that again a little bit like the spiritualist women, in which they are getting comforted and trying to find a way to connect to their loved ones. But for the most part, these are just works that were created by people who are experimenting with things like double exposures and the way that light refracts off the lens. So I don't see this really as a way to, bring the dead back or to summon the dead close to you. But it's really interesting. And my question is something that I don't really know if I have the answer to, but something that I keep thinking about with these women who are creating these spiritual paintings or with the spirit photography is that if they were a big ruse, if it was done by charlatans, obviously that's not a great thing. That's so unkind to be able to be profiting off of someone's grief. At the same time, there were so many people who did receive some sort of modicum of comfort from this event and from these things. So whether or not they learned that they were being taken advantage of is one thing. But I also have to say, if it brought them some sort of solace, that stands for something. So let that be, I guess, as it may.
I'm the director of our historical society, and we have a period home, which is the founder's home. And we have an example of hair art.
Ooh.
And it kind of has that connection to a lost loved one as well. So we have some of that on display in the house.
Yeah. No, I love that. The ability, I think, in so many ways to actually literally have a representation of someone and something that's so physical like that, so tangible, it can bring us back to a person in a way that I think is more profound than just the separation of an image that you might get from a painting or a photograph. Something that has their hair, an actual part of their body. That's a big deal.
There's a chapter in your book which discusses the nexus between conspiracy and art. In one particular situation, during the Cold War, the CIA actually helped fund art exhibitions of abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock. You have a chapter. In that chapter, it's dedicated to that connection. What was the propaganda assets inventory, the exhibition that was created from that, the advancing of American art, and how did the CIA bankroll all of these efforts without the public knowing about it?
Oh, this was one of my favorite chapters to write. And it's actually a story that I had not personally heard about until I would say maybe 4 years ago. Somebody said, hey, did you ever hear about the CIA's connection to abstract expressionism? And I had no idea. But basically, it's a rather convoluted story, but we're talking about post-World War II, the Cold War is starting to really ramp up. And when Harry Truman formed the CIA, he had a subsection of the agency that he created called the Propaganda Assets Inventory. And what that was dedicated to was basically using cultural aspects to kind of shape the mind of the thinkers in the world. So to be able to influence influential writers, critics, artists, and so forth, not only in the U.S., but spread outward across the world, especially in countries that may be sort of on the fence, I guess you could say, between capitalist lifestyles and communist ones. And the idea was that using art was the best way to showcase the freedoms that people in the U.S. and other capitalist nations could experience. So comparing abstract expressionism to the kind of works of art that were being created in the USSR at the time. In the 40s and 50s, if you were a painter and you were really into abstract expressionism, you could create a work of art simply for your own interest. And it could be about nothing, or it could be just about the color blue. It could be whatever you wanted it to be. And there was nobody in the government who was going to step in and say, hold on, you're not painting the great leader, and I don't see anything that has any connection to this current political tenet. So whereas in Russia, there was really only one prescribed style of work of art that was called social realism. So it was very strict. It was extremely looked after by the government. People kept a real good eye on what was being promoted in the USSR. And so obviously it was completely different than the freedoms that we experienced in the US at the time. And so by showcasing these abstract works of art, it was thought that other people around the world could then look at it and say, oh, hey, this is so much better. Look at these artists. They can do whatever they want. They can paint whatever they want in whatever way they want. And so this portion of the CIA, the Propaganda Assets Inventory, put together a traveling exhibition that went through from the U.S. after kind of premiering me in the U.S. and going on all over the world, but especially in Eastern Europe, to showcase the greatness of U.S. art. And one of those was called Advancing American Art. And then there was a second one called The New American Painting. I believe the New American Painting was far more successful and it traveled a lot further. But the earlier version was Advancing American Art was not treated with as much respect, at least not within the U.S. So one of the things that happened was there was this changeover where it's hard to discuss so kind of succinctly, but what really happened was that the CIA started going to other art institutions, so museums in particular, and MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, was really at the forefront of this, where they came in and asked for their covert help. And they established what was called long leash policy, wherein there was this separation by a number of degrees, 2 or 3 steps, sometimes more, between what was actually going on with the CIA promoting and trying to fight the Cold War in art and between what was actually being seen. So people thought that MoMA was putting on this great traveling exhibition and handpicking artists just completely of their own accord when it was actually being bankrolled and supported entirely by the CIA. But no one knew that for about 50 years, and the documents were classified for so long that not even the artists who were part of these exhibitions would have known that their work was being put forward for these political means. It's really interesting.
So what if the CIA would approach you and say, Jennifer Dasal, we need your help. Your country needs you. What would you say as the current curator of a museum?
I would say, yeah, that's a great question. I think I would say I need more information, first of all. And I'd also want to know what their timeline is. You know, I think it's amazing. It's something that I think is really interesting about the CIA's support of abstract expressionism in particular is that ABEX art became the art movement of the mid-20th century. It was the thing that a lot of historians point to as the moment where the focus of art moved from Europe, especially Paris, over to New York, and that America for the first time became the world leader in art. And that was a really big deal. And I keep thinking, would that have happened, or would it have happened so quickly that people like Jackson Pollock would have had such renown during their own lifetimes in something that really wasn't far loved or supported in the U.S. had it not been for the CIA? I don't think that's actually possible. I think the CIA's support in many ways of this type of work is really what made it hit such huge historical highs. So it's really interesting.
I'm interested in the odyssey of the Salvator Mundi because I actually lived in Saudi Arabia for a year, and I saw those images of the king and the crown prince and other princes, and it was all over the place. This is a famous painting of Christ.
Yeah.
Does the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, actually own that art?
That is what people say. This has not been confirmed. So the very weird thing about Salvator Mundi is that I think hopefully many listeners will remember that if they're paying attention to the art world in 2017, it made a huge splash. Over $450 million was spent on this one single work of art. It is to date, the most expensive work of art ever sold at auction. And it immediately sort of disappeared from the public eye. And over the last, I would say, especially 2 to 3 years, there have been lots of rumors of where this painting has ended up. For a while, it looks like it was going to be on view as part of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and then that never ended up happening. And then in the last 2 years especially, recent rumors are that it is in bin Salman's custody. But again, no one still has seen it. And even now, I check every couple of months. I pretty much Google around just to see if anything has come up. And the work of art is still not in the public eye. But yes, it looks like it's probably something that he owned. And it's really interesting because of the tradition of not showing people's faces in art. There's this tradition of what's called aniconic art in Islamic nations, where to have a rendition of someone's face, especially somebody who is a religious figurehead in such a conservative nation, is really seen as very taboo, very sacrilegious. So there is this thought that some people believe that maybe it might potentially be semi-off view because a lot of these ultra-conservative heads of the government are feeling very, very opposed to having a work of art of that subject matter on view. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I can see the difficulty in getting a lot of support for an image like this in that kind of realm.
Well, in Saudi Arabia, he's known as MBS, and there is this idea called Vision 2030 or the 2030 vision. Mm-hmm. And it's about modernizing and opening up Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly closed society, but he's trying to do that. Now, of course, he's done all kinds of other things that dictators do. But right. In this case, he has given women more freedom, given them the ability not to wear the abayas or the burqas and so forth, allowing them to drive. That's all part of this 2030 vision. I don't know if it would extend to religious iconography. That seems a bridge too far. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you the Matawa are off the streets of Saudi Arabia. They're no longer there. The enforcers that were there.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not on the streets anymore. And I was in Jeddah, which is the most liberal city in Saudi Arabia. Now, that's liberal it's not San Francisco.
Right. Of course.
But it's a little more open there than other places. But the Matawa are off the streets, and that was all part of the 2030 vision. So you never know. Wow. Maybe it'll come out someday.
I know.
It might be on MBS's yacht, just
that's what they say,
hanging on the wall.
Which I always think is just such an odd choice. But just as an insurance liability alone, I just want to say, move it off land somewhere, just for safety. You never know. I personally agree with you. I think that could actually be part of that larger vision plan, because in the last decade, the Middle East has really become a huge hotspot for art. And I can see that potentially Saudi Arabia wants to get in there, especially as a competitor to Dubai, for example. So I think it will come back into the limelight. I'm just waiting to know when that will be. And I personally would love to be able to go somewhere and see it. I will spend $1 or $2 going across to Saudi Arabia to go to some museums. I definitely would.
In your chapter on Marcel Duchamp, sometimes I get these names wrong, so if I get the pronunciation wrong, I apologize.
No, you're good. Marcel Duchamp, indeed.
Okay. And you specifically talk about Fountain. Mm-hmm. Would you talk about the story and the importance of Duchamp and challenging the notion, not necessarily on the quality of art or what makes one piece of art, quote, good and another, quote, bad?
Absolutely.
So sometimes there's this line, and you talk about it in your book, and it's a very thin line between art and trash, which is crazy to think about, but it can be a very thin line. Can you talk about that chapter in your book and Fountain?
Absolutely. No, I love that. You're exactly right in that in some cases it looks like an actual piece of trash. And that may have been one of the reasons why we actually don't have the original work of art from 1917, the original work of art called Fountain. So in the early part of the 20th century, Duchamp came over from Paris to New York and really established himself as one of these premier thinkers from Europe post-World War I and dealing with the idea of what art actually is, which is really tricky when you think about it. When I was in graduate school, I remember one of our first courses was a professor sat our graduate group down and said, "Tell me what art is." And that has to be one of the hardest questions I've ever had to answer, because to many, it's very, very subjective. And Duchamp really wanted to challenge that idea of what art was, which at that point had really been very strict. So it's things like a particular type of painting or a sculpture. Now there's a lot more freedom where there's a blurring between art and craft, objects that have more of a utilitarian use versus what's considered to be high art, pop culture art, and so forth. There's a lot more of this question. I think it's a looser determination now. But Duchamp, at that point, he really wanted to say, okay, I'm going to, quote unquote, create a work of art by basically taking something that's already been created that isn't anything having to do with the art world. So in his case, he took a urinal, turned it upside down, and slapped a signature on it. And it wasn't even his signature. It was sort of an experiment. So he basically gave it the name of Richard Mutt, was the pseudonym that he took. And he submitted it to an art exhibition purported to be as long as you paid the admission fee or the entry fee for your work of art, then your work would be accepted for this art show. And he wanted to test that theory. And so he sent it forward anonymously in that way and said, "I am Richard Mutt, and here is my work of art." And it was not put on view. It was basically sent away and hidden from view during the public exhibition period. And people really got angry about this. It became this big scandal because it was a form of censorship. And when it was actually found and taken away after the show, it then somehow disappeared. And the thought was that it was indeed mistaken for a piece of trash and thrown away. And it was only decades later that Duchamp came in and basically commissioned reproductions of his work of art. So there are several Duchamp fountains around the world, but they are not this original iconic one. But I think it's really interesting because the big deal is basically that he said it is art because I say it's art. So how do we define a work of art? Do the artists purely have the say? Do we as viewers have the say? I think it's really interesting because who physically gets to determine what is actually a work of art? And in some cases, there's a really interesting art exhibition there's actually been a number of art exhibitions that have had issues over the years, but some art exhibitions were actually moved or destroyed or even just swept up as garbage because they looked like actual garbage. People just don't really know what to do necessarily if you're not used to seeing a work of art that's made of crumpled newspaper or discarded boxes. So I can see why the mistake happens. And I think it's really interesting.
It's interesting because I had a Duchamp moment myself today, and it was because of your book, and I was thinking about this question. It was actually part of my job, and I was looking at an old building in town. It's in disrepair. It's falling apart. It was from a friend of Abraham Lincoln's who used to live there a long time ago. Now the windows are busted out, and I walked around the back, and there was this pile of bricks. And it used to be an outbuilding, and now it was just a pile of bricks, and there was some grass and stuff growing in it. And I literally thought of Duchamp. I'm like, in the right context, that could be a piece of art. And this just happened naturally. The building just crumbled. And
absolutely.
And I'm like, if this was in the right context, telling that story about what this structure used to be and what it is now and what it means about, maybe how we view architecture or whatever. You can make any type of connection there. But I actually thought about that today. I was thinking about Duchamp, and I don't think about him much, Jennifer, but I did think about him today.
But it is really interesting, though, because it's like once that concept that Duchamp really pioneered in so many ways, that once it gets into our collective consciousness, I think that was really one of the biggest deals of the 20th century in terms of the art world, is this moment of being able to go forward and question who gets to make art, what is art, and really expand it into the fact that anyone could call anything art. And that you see that and, in your mind now that building is art. And that's really cool.
So the most infamous art theft in history, and you mentioned this in your book as well, I actually watched this on Netflix just, I think, yesterday. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. There was a heist in 1990. Several very expensive pieces of art went missing.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the possible ties to mafia, it was an interesting story, but it wasn't rewarding because they don't find the art at the end.
Yeah.
I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but it's still missing. So what happened at the Gardner Museum that night? And why do you think circumstances like that, where art has been stolen, which is not a new concept, why do you think that art has never been found?
That is another question that I really wish I had the answer to, that I don't. And it's really funny because I feel I haven't finished watching. I have one episode left of that Netflix documentary, but I have
I
read
blew
about...
it for you.
No.
I'm sorry.
I feel like the moment if these works of art ever come back, I mean, you're going to hear about it for so long. It's just going to be the biggest front page news for so long. But I've listened to multiple podcast series that have dealt just with the Gardner theft. I've read books just about the Gardner theft. And it is really strange. It just might be my own personal biases as being an art historian and being a curator. But the moment that they start transitioning away from talking about the importance of the works of art and to the non-art related reasons why somebody might want to steal a work of art, it's like my mind doesn't capture all of it. So I feel like I'm not very well suited to answering the question because I don't know the answer. A lot of people are pointing to potential mob ties, and there's been this discussion of whether or not it's the Italian mob versus the Irish supporting mob, so people who are working with the IRA in the northern part of Ireland. I don't know what to believe because there does seem to be this element of potential insider access or an inside job. But the fact that nothing has shown up and the fact that no one seems to have come forward with any sort of credible lead that investigators can follow up on, that makes me nervous because the reward is large for a normal person. It's, $10 million. And so you'd think that someone would know something enough to come forward, even though that's really just a drop in the bucket compared to what the value of the artworks actually are, which is around 200 million or even 500, some sources say. So I don't know, but it makes me worried that maybe these pieces are damaged to the point of no return, or even that they've been destroyed. I certainly hope that's not the case, but they've been gone for so long now. It's been 30 years, over 30 years. And so unless they are in the tip-top condition of, a most wonderful condition laid out flat or even reframed up on a wall in some place that's perfectly climate controlled, I can't imagine that they are in any good shape at all, which even makes it a concern, even if they were rediscovered or returned, that they might never be able to be put back on view, at least not in the same way.
It was pretty amazing that the mafia realized, not just in this case, but stolen art could be a get-out-of-jail-free card. It wasn't a case where they were trying to sell it and make the money, because that's very difficult to do. You'd have to have it all lined up even before you even stole the item, that you would have a buyer lined up. But what they had done, and it wasn't anything new, where they would say, I can tell you where this item is if this guy gets 10 years off his sentence or if you let me go. That was an interesting aspect of it, because they offered that to several of these mafia individuals to say, if you tell us where this is, you basically can go home.
Right. And I think that's the part that's so interesting, is because it becomes part of a currency. And sometimes the currency is secrets, and sometimes the currency is information. The fact that it actually hasn't worked up to this point is what's really of interest and really concerning. Because if it was true that somebody had the right amount of information, then people, in theory, could go in and find the works of art. And that hasn't happened. So I don't know. I try to stay optimistic. I am hopeful. And, the more that people learn about the case, the more that the details are shown in a documentary like this one, the better it is, because more people maybe can keep their eyes out or find themselves interested in helping to solve the mystery in any sort of way. But I don't know. I hope they show up. That's the best I can do.
Well, sometimes historical artifacts show up that way. I think the Declaration of Independence was found on the back of a painting one time, so you never know. It could happen.
Yeah, it's true. stranger things have happened for sure.
So my last question, and it kind of ties into what we were just talking about, of all the art that has been lost or stolen, maybe from the Nazis acquiring art as they marched across Europe, or the mafia connections we just talked about, or maybe just the international black market, what are some of the most valuable pieces that are still out there missing?
Ooh, that's also such a great question. The first thing that always comes to mind when I think about Nazi stolen works or things that are still kind of remaining from World War II is I think about the Amber Room just outside of St. Petersburg. It was this incredible room. It's not a painting per se, but it was this beautiful space that was filled with all kinds of precious jewels that literally lined the walls with amber from the Baltic Sea and with rubies, sapphires, and it was incredible. And it was around ever since the end of the 18th century as part of the Tsar's treasures. And when the war came up, when it looked like troops were coming into Russia at the end of the Second World War, there was this knowledge that they were coming, and people in the royal palaces outside of St. Petersburg tried their best to actually hide the room by basically wallpapering over it and paneling over it so that when the invader troops came in, that they would not be able to locate it. Unfortunately, the idea of the Amber Room, the story of its magnificence has really been around for 200 plus years. So everybody knew where the room actually was. And so they were able to see through the ruse. And the room was dismantled bit by bit and taken to Germany. The story of where it actually ended up after that pretty much went cold because it was supposedly held in a particular castle that was then bombed by the Allies. So the question was whether or not the works were destroyed during the bombing, if they were moved to another location prior to that bombing occurring, and no one really knows. The idea is that maybe several pieces have shown up over the years. And it seems like every year or so, there's this new news story that comes across my desk that says, historians think that there's this underground bunker in Poland or that there was a train that was buried that may have the Amber Room, but it never pans out. It's like the Gardner Museum heist in that way, where it gets a lot of attention and people get really hopeful and then nothing happens. So I don't know if it still extends in any way or if it was destroyed during the bombing. But it seems like that it probably was destroyed because we're just not seeing any evidence of the real deal showing up anywhere. And about 10 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer, the Russian government actually commissioned a whole redo of the Amber Room. So you can still go see the Amber Room. It's just a replica version of it now, but it's still made out of the same precious material, but it's just not the ones that Catherine the Great feasted her eyes on, for example.
Well, the good thing about it is, just like a sunken treasure on a ship, as long as the story's out there, there'll be individuals and people going out trying to find it. So we can hold out hope that some of those things are found.
I agree. And I think in some ways, sometimes those stories of the missing is what will drive people to seek it out. So I think about the Gardner in particular. If it wasn't for the theft, this horrible story, and the fact that you can go in and see those empty frames on the wall, that becomes a way to drive people in because people want to see the evidence of something that was once there that now isn't. So it actually, there's that little bit of silver lining, I suppose you could say.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned, you got me art curious now. So when I walked around the building today, I looked at a pile of bricks and I thought, Duchamp, and that's the first time that's happened. So
I'm happy to have assisted you.
So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
I would like to thank my guest, art historian and author Jennifer Dasal. And if you would like to get her book, ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd and Strangely Wonderful in Art History, all you have to do is click on the link in the description below. ArtCurious is a colorful look at the world of art history, revealing some of the strangest, funniest, and most fascinating stories behind the world's greatest artists and masterpieces. Our featured brew was Hell's Belle Belgian Blonde Ale from the Big Boss Brewing Company of beautiful Raleigh, North Carolina. If you liked our talk today, please share the episode with a friend. And remember to subscribe to the podcast. As I mentioned earlier, all you have to do, hit the subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get those new episodes immediately when they're released. For more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page and check out our YouTube channel as well. Appropriately, the music was provided by the North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to find out what they have going on, just click on their link in the description below. It's down there as well. To our growing list of listeners and supporters from several countries and hundreds of cities across America, once again, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on the Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, covering the culinary taste of the Greedy Queen, Greek poems in the gods, and a memoir of plunder, family property, and Nazi gold. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
For me, intellect is too dry a word, too inexpressive. I like the word believe. Believing is more. I think that people in general, when they say, I know, they don't know, they believe. I believe that art is the only form of activity in which man, as man, shows himself to be a true individual and is capable of going beyond the animal state, because art is an outlet towards regions which are not ruled by time and space. To live is to believe. That's my belief.